They called him the Oracle of the Nations, a man whose voice made presidents bow, whose hands healed the incurable, whose stadium-sized crusades were broadcast live to millions. Prophet Luke Adebayo Elijah wasn't just a preacher. He was a brand, a god among men. His followers knelt in reverence, kissing the very earth he walked on. His name rang like a divine bell in every corner of Nigeria and beyond. Yet beneath the robes of righteousness was a soul soaked in blood and darkness. Whispers swirled around him of secret chambers, fetish altars, blood rituals, and women silenced by fear. But none dared speak aloud. Until one night, the police raided one of his healing centers in Port Harcourt, and what they found would shake the world. Frozen organs, labeled jars. Bodies were never buried. And just like that, the man of God became a national disgrace. The church collapsed. His loyal followers rioted, confused and betrayed. His wife, once his shadow in ministry, vanished. His children, once royalty, became targets of a bitter, vengeful public. This is the story of how a nation was deceived. How one man's empire, built on blood and lust, came crashing down. This is the prophet's curse, the rise and fall of a false god. A gripping Ayansi folktale based on true struggles of blind faith, power, deception, and redemption. If you've ever believed in miracles, this story will make you question everything. Stay tuned. This isn't just entertainment. It's a warning. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Ayansi Folktales at TV Parrot African Folktales Room for weekly African stories that pierce the heart and open the eyes.
The heat was unbearable that Sunday afternoon, but the faithful came anyway. Over 50,000 people gathered at the Miracle Dominion Arena in Lagos, their faces glowing with anticipation. They had come to see the prophet, Luke Adebayo Elijah, the man who healed HIV with a touch and called phone numbers from the pulpit. In a white robe glistening with gold embroidery, he stepped onto the stage. The crowd roared. His presence felt electric, like God himself had descended. He raised his staff. "Today," he bellowed, "your story changes." A woman screamed and fell to the ground. Possessed, they said. The prophet touched her forehead. She convulsed and then went still. The crowd erupted. Another miracle. But backstage, Elijah's private bodyguard handed him a velvet pouch. Inside were cowries, black powder, and a blood-stained handkerchief. He smiled. "You can't fake power," he muttered. Unknown to the crowd, his miracles weren't divine. They were choreographed illusions, a fusion of showbiz, hypnotism, and fetish practices. He learned everything in the secret shrines in Ijebu. As his fame grew, so did his secrets. And soon, even his closest allies would begin to wonder, is this still God's man, or the devil in disguise? Behind every great man, they say, is a woman. But behind Prophet Luke Adebayo, Elijah were three. To the world, his only wife was Mama Prophetess Esther, Mummy G.O., elegant, soft-spoken, and always seated beside him on the altar. She wore her scarf like a crown, and her prayers could move a crowd to tears. She was the picture of virtue. But few knew about the other two women. One was Sister Chika, his intercessor, who traveled everywhere with him and prayed beside his bed. The other was Ngozi, a former usher now promoted to spiritual assistant, known for her late-night visits to the prophet's private chambers in the name of prophetic mentorship. His aides knew but said nothing. His pastors knew but feared everything. He had a gift for manipulation, twisting scripture to suit his cravings. David had many wives, he once said to a junior pastor who dared question him. If God were angry, he would have struck me down. Every night, after the miracles and offerings, he slipped out through a hidden corridor in his mansion. Not to pray, but to indulge. Wine, women, and rituals wrapped in secrecy. Meanwhile, Mummy G.O., Esther, knew. She always knew. But she stayed, for the children, for the name, for fear of what he might do. Still, the burden was killing her slowly. The smiles in public were masks. At night, she wept in silence, holding a pillow soaked with betrayal. And the children? They were already learning to lie, to pretend, to cover their ears when the screams came from their father's room. Not from demons, but from his lovers. Prophet Elijah was building an empire. But the foundation was cracking, and soon the world would hear the thunder. The Miracle Dominion Arena had a secret. Beneath the 1,000-seater auditorium, beyond the locked steel door behind the baptismal tank, was a place no worshiper was ever meant to see. They called it the inner chamber. To the public, it was a prayer room. But for Prophet Luke Adebayo Elijah, it was his real altar, where miracles were manufactured, not prayed for. Inside were shelves lined with jars. Some were filled with animal blood, others with dark oils and dried herbs. The clay pot sat in the corner, constantly burning incense that made the air heavy. And in the center, a raised platform, carved with symbols older than Christianity, which served as the seat of power. This was where he came to renew his grace. His spiritual father, Baba Segun, a voodoo priest from Ogun State, visited once a month to perform rituals. Chickens were slaughtered, candles were lit. Names of stubborn members were written and buried beneath the altar to either silence or spiritually blind them. People don't come to God, Baba Segun told him once. They come for results, so give them that. And he did. From fake healings using bribed actors to women who claimed barren wombs were suddenly fruitful, all were paid for their roles, and all were staged, not a miracle. But sometimes, real power was needed. For that, the shrine worked overtime. One night, a child went missing after a deliverance service. Rumors flew. Church security denied everything. CCTV footage disappeared. But insiders knew what had happened. The sacrifice was necessary. The next level of grace had a price, and Elijah paid it. The miracles became more shocking. The fame grew. Politicians now begged for private sessions. His name trended daily. But upstairs in the sanctuary, where the crowd danced and worshipped, no one knew their prophet's true altar lay in the bowels of darkness. The queue outside the prophet's mansion started forming before dawn. Billionaires, barren women, drug lords, and senators were all united by one desire: a miracle. Inside, the anointing had a price: 5 million naira for international visa breakthroughs, 2 million naira for instant pregnancy, 10 million naira for political favor or election victory. Even death could be delayed for the right offering. They called it seeding for the supernatural, and people emptied their life savings. Elijah would place his hand on their heads, speak in strange tongues, and pour holy oil imported from Israel, which was bought in bulk from Balagun market. They left with tears and testimonies, or curses, depending on how obedient they were. Miracle sessions were live-streamed with dramatic flair. One boy rose from the dead. A blind woman regained her sight, except she was seen 2 weeks later, acting in a local drama group. Everything was a show, every testimony, a script. And behind it all, Prophet Luke Adebayo was counting cash. He had investments in 5 countries, private jets, hospitals, a university. But he never built a free school, never fed the poor, never visited the sick unless cameras were present. Even his inner circle began to ask questions. Pastor Micah, his longtime associate, once said, "Daddy, are we not deviating from God?" Elijah stared him down and said, "Touch not my anointed." Micah left the ministry the following week. A week later, he died in a car crash. Survivors claimed the brakes failed. Others said he was cursed. No one dared question again. To the world, Prophet Elijah was a river of blessings. But in reality, he was a well of greed, slowly poisoning everything he touched. And though his cup was overflowing, the day of reckoning was already sharpening its knife. They started as faint murmurs. A junior choir member found a charm buried beneath the altar. A cleaner spotted bloodied clothes inside a sealed box. A young usher swore he saw a naked woman running through the compound at midnight, but was warned never to speak of it again. "Touch not the anointed," the elders warned. "Loyalty is silence," they echoed, "but secrets are like smoke. They rise, they spread, they choke." The prophet's estranged first son, David, returned from Canada after 5 years of self-exile. Now a grown man, he wanted answers. As a boy, he had once walked into his father's private room and seen a goat being slaughtered while men chanted in a language he didn't understand. That night, his mother told him never to speak of it again. But David had grown bold and angry. "Dad is not a prophet," he whispered to his younger siblings. "He's something else." His sister, Ruth, covered her ears. "Don't say that. God will punish you." "Will he?" David challenged. "Or has he been waiting?" Meanwhile, Prophet Elijah grew more paranoid. Cameras were installed in every corridor. Phones were banned near his quarters. Trusted aides began to vanish or be reassigned abroad. Even his wife was locked out of certain meetings, but the walls were closing in. A journalist named Amaka, once a church media volunteer, had begun investigating. She was quiet, patient, and thorough. And one night, she bribed her way into the prophet's private library and found a flash drive. It contained videos, dark rituals, naked initiations, names, transactions, even the missing child case, documented. She didn't scream. She just quietly left. And from that moment, the prophet's countdown had begun. The God of men was about to face the gods of justice. The news broke like thunder on a Sunday morning. Breaking: Prophet Luke Adebayo, Elijah linked to underground organ harvesting ring. The headline flashed across every major TV station and social media platform. Nigerians gasped. The world froze. Police raids had uncovered a hidden medical facility in one of his healing camps in Port Harcourt. Refrigerators full of preserved organs, hearts, kidneys, livers, labeled and cataloged. Some matched names of church members who'd gone missing over the past 3 years. The prophet's defense? It's a setup. Satan is fighting the anointed. But photos leaked. A video showed a man, blindfolded and strapped, being wheeled into an underground chamber. Another clip captured a prayer-turned-surgical ritual. Blood everywhere. Faces masked, except one, the prophet himself, holding a scalpel and chanting. The world erupted. Members wept. "No! Daddy can't do this!" Some pastors went into hiding. Others publicly denounced him. His foreign branches were shut down within days. His estate was sealed, assets frozen, donations refunded. And then came the arrest. Lagos Airport, private terminal, attempting to flee to Ghana with 2 of his spiritual daughters. Dressed in jeans and a hoodie, head bowed, hands cuffed, a far cry from the glorious robes he once wore. The crowd outside the courthouse screamed curses as he arrived. "Wicked man! You killed my son! God will judge you!" Inside, his wife Esther sat frozen, children beside her, not as royalty, but as defendants of shame. Reporters chased her. "Did you know? Were you part of it?" But she said nothing. Her world had ended the moment the flash drive surfaced. The man she married had built a kingdom on blood. Now, that kingdom was falling like a house of ash in the rain. And the worst part? This was only the beginning of the pain. The mansion, once called Heaven's Gate Estate, was now a ghost house. Its marble floors, once walked by dignitaries, were stained with dust. Portraits of Prophet Luke Adebayo, Elijah had been torn off the walls, some defaced with red paint by angry mobs. Looters had stripped the compound of valuables. The fountain outside now ran in silence. Inside, Mama Esther sat in the corner of her former prayer room, eyes blank, her white scarf lying crumpled on the floor. They had taken everything. The cars, the church branches, the television station, the school, even her name. Reporters called her the Widow of Wickedness. People spat when she walked past. Church members who once knelt before her now hurled stones. Her children fared worse. David, the first son, couldn't walk freely without disguises. He had tried defending his mother online. The trolls were brutal. "Shut up, ritualist's child. Go and donate your own kidney to your father's God." Ruth, the prophet's only daughter, dropped out of university after classmates started a petition demanding her expulsion. The youngest, Emmanuel, only 12, now mumbled prayers in his sleep and screamed at night. "Daddy, please, don't take them! Don't take them!" Psychologists called it trauma-induced hallucination. But Esther knew better. She remembered the nights her husband burned candles over Emmanuel's head and said, "This one must carry the mantle." Now, the mantle was a curse. The government offered no protection. Police patrols came and went. Protesters gathered daily at the mansion gates, demanding justice, threatening revenge. The prophet had been denied bail. His trial loomed, and with every revelation, the shame deepened. But in her quiet suffering, Esther made a silent vow. "The truth may have destroyed us, but I won't let it finish us." The trial began with a shockwave. As Prophet Luke Adebayo Elijah was escorted into the courtroom, his hands shackled, his once glorious aura had all but disappeared. His followers were no longer there to shield him. There were no thousands of people chanting his name, no cameras capturing his divine light. The room was filled with skepticism, anger, and disgust. He was no longer a man of God. He was a criminal. But despite the mounting evidence, Elijah remained defiant. "I am innocent," he insisted in a shaky voice, his once commanding tone now fragile. "They want to destroy me because I am anointed. I heal the sick. I cast out demons. This is a spiritual war." His defense was a spectacle. His lawyer claimed the prophet had been framed by rival pastors, demonic forces seeking to bring down his ministry. The same old excuses, the same old lies. His wife, Esther, sat in the front row, a hollow shell of the woman she once was. The weight of betrayal sat heavy on her chest. She could barely look at him, could barely hear him speak. "How could I not have known?" she thought in agony. "How did I let this happen?" Her trust, shattered into 1,000 pieces, couldn't be repaired. Yet, despite the chaos around her, Esther remained determined not to lose her family entirely. In the quiet of their home, with the world watching their every move, she began preparing for the inevitable fallout. But not everything was set in stone. the shocking truth came in the form of an unexpected witness. Pastor Tayo, Elijah's former associate, who had left the ministry years ago, stepped forward. With trembling hands, he held up a stack of photos, images of Elijah in the secret shrine, conducting rituals, with men and women bound in dark oaths. "I witnessed it all," Tayo said, his voice thick with emotion. "I stood by him. I helped him deceive millions. I was his right-hand man until I realized the truth." His testimony shattered the last of the prophet's defenses. Elijah's empire was crumbling, not just from the weight of the evidence, but from the betrayal of the very people who had stood beside him. Esther knew one thing: her family would never be the same again. But she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The days blurred together as the court case dragged on, but one thing was clear: Elijah's world was gone. His once powerful ministry, filled with extravagant crusades and followers who would have died for him, had turned into a broken shell. The media painted him as a monster. The streets mocked his name. And inside his holding cell, he sat alone, a man without purpose, without power. Esther couldn't look at him anymore. The man she had once called her husband was no longer the man she had married. The prophet she had stood beside for years had become a criminal, a fraud, a liar, and in the deepest part of her soul, she hated him for it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her children had now become symbols of the scandal. David, once a promising young man with a bright future, was now an outcast, ridiculed by his peers and publicly vilified. Ruth, the daughter who had grown up under the shadow of her father's fame, had become the object of pity, the victim of her father's sins. Emmanuel, the youngest, still clung to memories of his father's miracles. He would whisper prayers at night, praying for his father's return, unaware of the darkness that had consumed him. But the whispers were getting louder. The nightmares grew stronger. It was as though the sins of his father were taking root inside him, poisoning his innocence. Esther watched her children suffer, their lives marked by a curse they never asked for. She had always known the cost of her husband's ambition, but she never imagined it would cost her children their future. With each passing day, the trial grew worse. More victims came forward, more damning evidence emerged. Luke Adebayo's network of ritualistic practices, his links to powerful criminals, and the stolen organs all came to light. His followers, many of whom had believed him to be a prophet of God, began to turn on him. Some denounced him publicly, while others simply disappeared, their faith shattered. And then came the final blow. The church, the empire built on deception and false miracles, was officially dismantled. His assets were seized, and the government announced plans to use the money to fund a national initiative for victims of organ trafficking. Elijah's fall from grace had been swift, but its ripple effect would be felt for years to come. As Esther sat in her empty mansion, staring at the broken pieces of her life, she wondered if it was too late to start over. Could they rebuild from the ashes? Or was the damage irreversible? One thing was certain. No matter how hard she tried, she would never erase the stain of her husband's actions. The kingdom he had built was gone, and in its place was nothing but ruin. The weeks after the verdict were the hardest. Prophet Luke Adebayo Elijah was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, including organ trafficking, ritualistic murders, and fraud. The news spread like wildfire, his name now synonymous with betrayal and evil. The once beloved prophet, the healer of nations, was reduced to a criminal in chains. But even as the walls of justice closed in around him, the remnants of his empire still clung to life. Thousands of followers, disillusioned but faithful, held on to the belief that their prophet would somehow rise again. They continued to gather in secret, praying for his return, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Esther, however, was done with the past. She packed what little was left of her dignity and her children's future into a small suitcase and left Lagos. She couldn't stay there anymore, not in the city where she had once been the first lady of a mega-church, now a pariah, mocked and shunned by everyone she once knew. She took her children to a small village in Oyo State, where they could heal in peace, away from the cameras, away from the judgments, and away from the bitter memories. At first, the adjustment was difficult. Ruth struggled with her identity, the shame of her father's deeds hanging over her like a dark cloud. David threw himself into activism, speaking against the dangers of false prophets and the harm they caused. Emmanuel, still too young to fully understand the depth of his father's betrayal, had to be reminded every day that it was not his fault. But as time went on, something changed. Esther found solace in helping others. She became involved in local charity work, feeding the poor, and offering support to victims of fraud and organ trafficking. It wasn't much, but it was her way of redeeming her own soul. Ruth started a foundation for young women who had been manipulated and taken advantage of by false prophets, while David used his platform to raise awareness and speak out against the dangers of blind faith. Emmanuel, with the pure heart of a child, began to heal. Slowly, but surely. The road to redemption was long and painful, but Esther realized something vital. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and rebuilding what could still be saved. Her children were not to blame for their father's crimes. They were their own people, capable of greatness, free from the legacy of their father's sins. One evening, as Esther stood by a river near their new home, she looked up at the sky, the stars now visible after a long time. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of peace. Maybe, she thought, the past can't be undone, but the future is still ours to shape. It had been 2 years since they left Lagos, but for Esther, it felt like a lifetime. In the quiet village of Igboho, life had a slow, healing rhythm. The pain of the past was still fresh, but it was beginning to fade, replaced by the simplicity of small joys. Her children, once trapped by the shadow of their father's scandal, were now carving out their own paths, finding strength in their shared struggle. Esther had become something she never thought she would be, a humble woman, unrecognized and content. She no longer wore expensive clothes or flaunted jewelry. Her days were filled with caring for the poor, working with orphaned children, and helping rebuild lives that had been shattered by false prophets like her husband. One day, she sat in the village square, listening to an old woman share stories of gods and spirits, of redemption and forgiveness. The words struck her heart, deep and clear. No one is beyond redemption. She had spent years building her life around a man who preached redemption, but had failed to practice it himself. But now, she realized that redemption was not just about forgiving others, it was about forgiving yourself. Esther had to forgive herself. Her children, too, had come to terms with the painful reality of their past. David had gained a reputation as a fierce advocate for victims of fraud, traveling the country and speaking in schools about the dangers of false prophets and blind faith. He no longer hid in the shadows of his father's crimes, but stood tall, proud of the change he was fighting for. Ruth's foundation had grown beyond her expectations. It was now a nationwide movement, empowering young women to reclaim their voices and expose exploitation in religious spaces. Ruth had become a symbol of resilience, showing the world that no matter how deep the wound, healing was possible. Even Emmanuel, who had once been a quiet child lost in nightmares, was now a cheerful 14-year-old, helping his mother at the local school. His laughter echoed in the home once filled with sorrow, and his innocence was a daily reminder that life could still be beautiful, despite the darkness of their past. As Esther walked through the village, she noticed how the once blank stares of her neighbors had turned into warm smiles. They had forgiven her, even if the world hadn't. They understood the true meaning of redemption. The past could never be erased, but it no longer defined her. And as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting a golden glow over the village, Esther whispered a prayer, not for vengeance, not for justice, but for peace, for healing, and for the strength to keep moving forward. Her family was rebuilding, her children were rising, and though the scars would remain forever, so too would the strength they had found together.
And so, dear listeners, when a man claims to be sent by God, test the spirit. For not all altars are holy, and not every miracle is from heaven. The prophet wore white, but his hands dripped with blood. He built an empire, but it was laid on bones. And when the thunder of truth struck, not even the loudest hallelujah could save him. This is not just a story. This is a warning to everyone that quickly jump into believing in every miracle. A lesson, a mirror for our time. If you've ever been deceived in the name of religion, if you believe truth must prevail over power, then don't just watch. Share this story far and wide. What would you do if your father was exposed as a false prophet? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more explosive African stories that unveil the truth, expose the dark, and empower